All right, let's get started writing the discussion sections. So typically in an academic paper, we move from general to specific, or we tend to make a point and then we develop it. And since I like food, I like to think of it in terms of pies: point, interpret, example, significance. So here's an example of what that might look like in a discussion section. You would make a point, maybe in a topic sentence. You would explain that point, maybe starting a sentence with, in other words, this means that. You would offer evidence or sources to support that point, or maybe to foil or show the opposite of that point. So you might start a sentence when you're offering an example that starts with, for example, we see this in research when, or this point is supported by other sources. For example, so and so writes that. But when introducing examples or research into your paper to illustrate your point, be sure to introduce the source to your unfamiliar reader by their first and last name and article title, summarizing and paraphrasing the source that you'll be using to support your point, and quoting from the source to support that point. Then you'll bring it all together by identifying how the sources connect back to your original point. Sometimes I'll even start a sentence with, this is important because. So notice that the models below follow this organizational model. And while their topics may differ, they demonstrate pies. So here's two examples. This first one comes from a student's paper on horror films. And she includes the subject heading, Daring the Nightmare. And I love a good subject heading. One purpose that horror films serve is that they allow audiences to, quote, dare the nightmare and remain unaltered. So that's our topic sentence. But what does it mean to dare the nightmare and remain unaltered? Well, in other words, this means that horror films create suspense using images that symbolize our fears about death, destruction, the afterlife, or the unknown, all of which we may be curious about, but also frighten us. Good visual images keep the audience on the edge of their seats, since they don't know what is yet to come, yet they are often begging for more. For example, Stephen King writes about this effect in Why We Crave Horror Films. Quote, we pay $4 or $5 and seat ourselves at 10th Row Center in a theater showing a horror movie. We are daring the nightmare. King argues that we want to be scared and want to be on the edge of our seats with the unknowing ahead. It feels cathartic to see the worst that can happen to someone or to see the worst behaviors in others, and then we can leave the theater knowing that we are safe and that there are people out there worse than we are. Just like in the classic horror film The Sixth Sense, we want to see dead people too. So another point that this author makes is that audiences see this characteristic illustrated, more specifically in The Orphanage, when audiences are encouraged to dare the nightmare of being haunted by ghosts after a little boy goes missing during a party. In the film, Laura, her husband, and her adopted son Simon move into an old home that she grew up in as an orphan. From the onset of the film, though, something seems mysterious about the house. The swing set outside would start to move and make creaking sounds. And then Simon starts speaking to imaginary children, including his new friend Tomas, who has a secret room in the house. Audiences are introduced to a nightmare world when, during a party, Simon, it's a Spanish film, so they say Simon, mysteriously goes missing, and it's as if he's vanished into thin air. When Laura and her husband search for Simon with the presence of the police, Laura decides to enlist the help of a psychic, Aurora, to help find him. In one scene, audiences see what Aurora sees, the presence of ghosts who are angry and scared. The presence suggests that something sinister happened in the house many years ago. When Laura is skeptical of what she sees, she thinks might have happened, let's try that again. When Laura is skeptical of what she thinks might have happened in the house and to her son, Aurora tells her, seeing is not believing, it's the other way around. Believe and you will see. In this case, this is significant because Aurora is telling audiences that they need to suspend their disbelief, both while watching the film and in their own lives. We all have those moments when we think someone might be watching us, or when we wonder if there are ghosts near us. The film is tapping into those fears that we all share and is asking us to dare the nightmare of the unknown and death. So notice here that in that second paragraph, you could also use those little markers to kind of help to see the rhetorical moves happening. Another point that audiences see this characteristic. In other words, in the film, Laura and her husband, for example, when Laura is skeptical, this is significant because in this case, Aurora is telling audiences. So if it helps when developing your papers and moving from general to specific, think about those kind of textual markers to kind of help jumpstart you into writing. There's another example of a discussion section that you can look at here. So this one is on media stereotypes of disability from about the Super Crip. After viewing many movies with the Super Crip stereotype, What's Eating Gilbert Grape feels refreshingly honest in its portrayal of disability. So this is the author's topic sentence. This is her point. In other words, the film moves away from the impairment defying story of the Super Crip and instead follows a more realistic take on the effects of cognitive impairment. The Super Crip is a particular narrative of the media that makes us feel a bit more comfortable with the idea of disability. The media thrives on these stories of Super Crips who are able to overcome their impairment in an uncharacteristically awe-inspiring way, driven by their own sheer will. For example, there is nothing particularly uplifting or spectacular about mentally retarded Arnie Grape, and that's just fine. He is lovable in his unabashed, innocent manner and leads a life that he is content with. In the opening scene of the movie, we see him and Gilbert anxiously awaiting for the long line of RVs to drive through the town like they do every year. Watching this gives Arnie pure pleasure and joy, although seemingly mundane to those around him. Arnie doesn't have any special talents that makes him exceptional. He isn't trying to go to college, despite all odds. His family is just relieved that he is able to live till his current age of 18. He isn't there to be an inspiration to us or to make us feel more comfortable about his impairment. Arnie is just fine being Arnie. This is important because the most important thing that we should recognize is that there is no reason for him not to be satisfied with his life or condition. And it is rare in a film that we see that conveys a side of disability that is not aspiring to be more like, to see someone not aspiring to be more like the rest of the general population. So here the student goes on to talk about another point that she wants to make. As a society, it is easy to adore these Super Crip narratives because we are attracted to the thought of someone who had once made us feel uneasy being able to be more like the rest of us. For example, or in other words, this means time and time again, we are fed a cookie cutter image of success that we then begin to attribute to all those who are disabled. This becomes an issue for the disabled community because Super Crips make up a very tiny percentage of the handicapped population. These expectations are not something that can be generally regarded as realistic. Yes, there are those who can overcome all odds and do the impossible, but to most, there are things that they simply cannot be obtained because of the severity of their impairment or the barriers that society has unintentionally placed in their way. For example, Eli Clare, a writer and transgender activist with cerebral palsy, writes in his essay The Mountain about the Super Crip, saying, Super Crip stories never focus on the conditions that make it so difficult for people with Downs to have romantic partners, for blind people to have adventures. This is significant because the media rarely sheds light on these issues, and we tend to remain unaware of the barriers that are long-lasting within the disabled community. It is important that we recognize these issues and stop putting all of our faith in the expectations that a super crit provides us so that changes can be made. The different and more straightforward portrayal of a cognitive disability like Arnie's is so important because it can represent a more significant portion of the disabled community, as opposed to a smaller supergrip population to a mass audience, therefore raising more awareness of how an impairment affects those who are disabled.